The boy said it so quietly that it almost disappeared into the morning air before it reached him. Don't move. Walter Graves stopped in the middle of his own driveway, one hand on his briefcase, the other holding his phone. His mind already 3 hours ahead in a boardroom across the city where a dozen men in expensive suits would be waiting for him to walk in and tell them what their company was worth. He was not a man who stopped easily. 71 years old, salt and pepper beard trimmed close to his jawline the way he had kept it for 30 years. Shoulders still square, eyes still sharp. He had built one of the largest private logistics firms on the East Coast from a single truck and a telephone in a rented office in 1986. He had survived 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeovers, a government investigation that lasted 14 months and found nothing, and a heart scare at 63 that put him in a hospital bed for 6 days and taught him absolutely nothing about slowing down. He did not stop in the middle of driveways, but something in the boy's voice made him stop. Follow me, the boy whispered. Please, sir, don't let the man at the gate see you. Walter looked down, a small boy in a faded blue shirt, 10 years old, maybe younger. He had appeared from behind the rose hedges that lined the east side of the property like he had been crouching there for hours, waiting for exactly this moment. Walter recognized him, or at least he thought he did. The housekeeper's son. He had seen him a few times carrying laundry baskets across the back lawn, always a few steps behind his mother, always quiet, always watching. Walter could not remember ever speaking to him directly. He could not remember ever learning his name. That thought, small as it was, would stay with him for a long time. Son, Walter said. He tried to keep his voice patient. He was already doing the math in his head. 40 minutes to the office, the Hartwick meeting at 10, a conference call at 11:30, a working lunch with the board's audit committee. Whatever this is, can we talk about it tonight? The boy did not let go of his sleeve. His fingers were small, but his grip was firm. And his eyes were not the eyes of a child playing a game. They were not the eyes of a boy who had wandered into the wrong part of the yard and gotten confused. They were the eyes of someone who had not slept the night before. Someone who had been carrying something too heavy for his age and had run out of room to carry it alone. If you go to that car, the boy said, his voice barely above a breath, you won't come back. I heard them say it last night, in the kitchen. Please, sir. Something cold passed through Walter's chest, a feeling he had not felt in a very long time. Not since the night his mother called him from the hospital in Monticello and told him his father had collapsed in the cornfield behind the house and was not getting up. But Walter Graves had spent his entire adult life on one principle. Do not react to surprises. React to facts. Surprises are emotional. Facts are useful. A man who reacts to surprises gets taken. A man who reacts to facts gets ahead. So he pushed the feeling down. He filed it away the way he filed away bad quarterly numbers, noted, acknowledged, dealt with later. And he looked toward the gate. His town car was there. Same model, same color, same plate as far as he could tell from 50 feet away. The driver was standing beside it with the rear door open, one hand on the handle, the other holding a phone. He was the right height, the right build, dark jacket, dark cap. Everything was as it should be. Everything was exactly as it was every Monday morning at 8:25. But there was something about the way the boy was holding his sleeve, something about the weight of those small fingers, something that made Walter look again, longer this time, more carefully. And this time he saw it. His regular driver was a man named Garrett Reed, 46 years old, former military, quiet in the way that men who have seen real things are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that most things are not worth saying. Garrett had worked for him for almost 4 years, and in that time, he had never missed a morning, never been late by more than 90 seconds, and never once complained about the early hours or the long waits or the silence that Walter preferred on his morning drives. Garrett wore a silver ring on his left thumb. It was a small thing. Most people would not notice it. Walter had not noticed it himself until a Christmas party 3 years ago, when he had made a joke about it after 2 glasses of bourbon, and Garrett had told him the story behind it. His father had given it to him on the day he shipped out. His father had died while he was overseas. Garrett never took it off. Not when he washed dishes, not when he worked on his car, not when he slept. Walter had felt slightly embarrassed for joking about it. He had not forgotten the feeling. He had not forgotten the ring. The man standing at the gate was not wearing a ring. Walter's eyes stayed on the driver's hands for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back down at the boy. "How do you know what you heard?" he asked quietly. "How do you know it was about me?" "Because they said your name," the boy whispered. "Mr. Graves, they said it 3 times, and they said your wife paid them already. Half last week, half when it was done." There are moments in a man's life when the floor beneath him stops being solid. Not all at once, not with a crack or a crash. It happens slowly, the way ice gives way on a pond in early spring. You feel it shift. You feel the surface bend. And for one long second, you stand perfectly still, not because you are calm, but because you understand that the next step you take will determine everything. Walter's chest did not move for a long moment. His lungs stopped. Then they started again slowly, the way they always did, when he received very bad news across a conference table and could not let anyone in the room see it. 26 years. He had been married to Eleanor for 26 years. He had met her at a faculty dinner at the university where she taught second grade. She had been wearing a green dress and laughing at something someone else had said, and he had thought she was the most unguarded person he had ever seen. She did not perform. She did not calculate. She simply was. He had spent his whole life around people who were always trying to be something, and she was the first person he had met who seemed content to just be someone. He had loved her for that. He had married her for that. And now a 10-year-old boy in a faded shirt was telling him that she had paid someone to make sure he never came home. But that thought was too large for this moment. So Walter did what he had done in every crisis of his professional life. He made the thought smaller. He broke it into pieces. He asked the next question. "Walk with me," he said quietly, slowly toward the side of the house. "Don't run. Don't look at the gate." The boy nodded once and let go of his sleeve. The two of them walked together across the polished stone path past the fountain that Walter had paid more for than most people paid for a house, past the marble bench where Eleanor sometimes drank her morning coffee when the weather was warm enough, and around the corner of the house where a tall row of cypress trees blocked the view from the front gate. When they were behind the trees, Walter knelt down. His knees protested the way 71-year-old knees protest, but he ignored them. He brought his eyes level with the boys. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elias, sir." "Ishorabad." Walter nodded slowly, the way he nodded when someone told him something he intended to remember for a very long time. He was locking the name into a place inside his head where important things were kept. A place that until this morning had been reserved for account numbers and contract dates and the names of men who had tried to take his company. "Elias," he said, "tell me everything. Slowly. Don't skip anything. Start from last night." The boy took a deep breath. His shoulders were trembling slightly, but his voice stayed steady. There was a quality in it that Walter would think about for weeks afterward. A steadiness that did not come from courage exactly, but from something older and quieter. The steadiness of a child who had learned early that the world does not always wait for you to be ready. "My mom was making tea in the kitchen," Elias said. "It was late. I was supposed to be sleeping, but I came down because I forgot my book. The lights in the kitchen were off except the one over the stove. But I could hear voices outside, on the back patio. 2 people. He paused. His eyes moved to the ground, then back up to Walter's face. A woman and a man. The man was not from the house. I had never heard his voice before. The woman was Mrs. Graves. Walter kept his face very still. He had spent 40 years in rooms where showing what you felt was the same as losing. He had perfected the art of the neutral expression, the face that gave nothing away. He wore it now, though what was happening behind it was something no boardroom had ever prepared him for. "She said everything is ready for the morning," Elias continued. "She said the driver had been replaced. She said her husband would be in the car at 8:30 and that he would not notice because he never notices anything in the morning. He is always reading his phone." The boy paused again. "And then she said that after today she would finally be free." Walter did not move. He stayed crouched behind the cypress trees with one hand resting on the cold stone of the garden wall, and he felt the entire shape of his life shifting underneath him, the way a foundation shifts when the ground beneath it has been quietly washing away for years. He thought about that word. Free. Eleanor had used it the way a person uses a word they have been saving for a long time. Not casually, not carelessly, with the weight of something that had been building in the dark. He pushed the thought aside. There would be time for it later, if he was still alive later. Elias, he said carefully, do you have anything else? Anything you can show me? The boy hesitated. He looked down at his shoes. Then he reached into the front pocket of his faded shirt and pulled out a small black object. It was an old phone, the kind that had been new maybe 6 years ago, with a cracked screen held together by clear tape along one corner. The kind of phone a mother gives her son when she gets a new one, knowing he will use it to play games and take pictures of insects in the garden and nothing more. My mom gave me this when she got her new one, Elias said. It still records sound. I was scared, so I pressed the button. I held it near the door. Walter took the phone carefully, the way a man might handle a piece of evidence that could change the outcome of everything. There was a single audio file saved from the night before, 11 minutes and 42 seconds long. You recorded it, Walter said. I didn't know what else to do, sir. I thought if I told my mom, she would say I was dreaming. I thought if I told nobody, then nobody would believe me later. Walter looked at the boy for a long moment. 10 years old, a cracked phone in his pocket. And he had thought further ahead in a single night than most of the executives Walter had hired in 4 decades. He pressed play. The first thing he heard was the sound of dishes settling in a sink, then the soft sliding noise of a patio door opening, then a voice. Eleanor's voice. It was calm, warm, measured. The voice she used at dinner parties when she was talking to someone she wanted to impress. The voice that had always made Walter feel proud because it was so natural, so effortless, so completely hers. He raised the volume. It has to look ordinary. He has to walk to the car himself. If anything is forced, if anything looks wrong, the police will find it within a day. He has to get in willingly. Then a man's voice, deeper, slower, careful in the way a person sounds when they have memorized what they are about to say and are reading it back from a list inside their own head. He will. 8:30 is his window. He never varies. He walks out. He opens his email. He gets in the car. The new driver knows the route. There's a place outside Hartwick where the road bends along the reservoir. The car will stop there. The rest happens after. A pause. A small sound that might have been ice in a glass. And the policy, the man asked. It pays out after 7 months, Eleanor answered. Accidental death, double indemnity. The lawyers have already reviewed it. There is no contest because there is no other beneficiary. I am the only one. The house the company shares, everything moves through the trust. The board cannot stop it. They tried to put protections in 2 years ago, but he signed them away during the merger. He never read the 3rd page. Walter closed his eyes. He remembered that day. A hotel desk in Boston, a stack of documents, a junior lawyer pointing at the signature lines with a pen that cost more than the table it was resting on. Walter had been tired. He had just come out of a 9-hour negotiation. He remembered being told that the 3rd page was administrative language. Standard, nothing to worry about. He remembered not asking. He had built an empire on reading every line of every contract, on never trusting a summary, on never taking someone's word when he could take their signature instead. And the one time he had let his guard down, the one time he had been too tired to read the 3rd page, it had been the page that would kill him. The recording continued, the man's voice again measured and unhurried. And after when everything is settled, we wait, Eleanor said. A year, maybe longer. We do not appear in the same room for at least 18 months. We say nothing. We change nothing. Patience is what makes this work. Walter stopped the playback. He did not need to hear the rest. He had heard enough to know that whatever life he had been living when he walked out his front door this morning, that life had ended sometime during the night while he was asleep in his own bed, 20 feet from the woman who had decided exactly when and where and how he would die. He looked at Elias. The boy was watching him with the patient eyes of someone who had been waiting all morning to be believed. Your mother, Walter said carefully. Does she know you recorded this? No, sir. Did she hear them too? I don't think so. She had the kitchen radio on. She was making tea. I think she heard nothing. Good. Walter exhaled slowly. I need you to keep it that way for now. Not because your mother would do anything wrong, but because the more people who know, the more people are in danger. Do you understand? Elias nodded. He had the kind of seriousness in his face that did not belong on a child, but had arrived there anyway the way weather arrives. Not because anyone invited it, but because it was time. Walter slipped the old phone into the inside pocket of his jacket. He could feel it resting against his chest, small and light, and holding inside it the sound of his own death being planned by the person who slept beside him every night. Then he stood up, brushed the dust off his trousers, and looked out through a gap in the cypress branches toward the front gate. The town car was still there. The fake driver had finished with his phone and was looking toward the house now. His weight was shifting from one foot to the other in the small way a man does when he has been told to wait somewhere for a specific reason and is starting to wonder why he is still waiting. Elias, Walter said, I need to see her before I do anything else. I need to see her with my own eyes. Do you understand why? The boy thought about it. Then he nodded. Because if you don't see her, he said, you might still believe she didn't do it. Walter looked at him for a long second. He realized that this child in a faded blue shirt, standing behind a row of trees with dust on his knees and a cracked phone in his pocket, had just described the exact shape of his hope in a fewer words than Walter himself could have used. Yes, Walter said. Exactly. They moved together along the back of the house, staying close to the wall, ducking under the low windows of the south wing. Walter had not crouched like this since he was a boy himself, hiding from his father in the cornfield behind the small house in Monticello where he had grown up. His father had been a man who worked 16-hour days and came home with dirt under his fingernails and a silence that filled every room he walked into. Walter had spent his childhood learning how to move through that silence without being noticed. He was surprised at how easily his body remembered. They reached the corner of the south wing. From there, through a screen of climbing jasmine that had been growing along the trellis since before Walter could remember who had planted it, they could see the back patio, the long stretch of lawn that sloped gently toward the gardener's shed, the white wrought iron table where Eleanor sometimes had her morning coffee. She was there. She was not alone. The man sitting across from her was the man whose voice had been on the recording. Walter knew it before he could explain how he knew it. The way you know a face you have seen in a photograph before you meet the person. The voice had created a shape in his mind, and the shape matched the man. He was tall, lean, somewhere in his early 40s with the kind of carefully kept hair that men have when they spend more time on their appearance than they admit. He wore a dark gray jacket over a black shirt. His hands rested on the table near Eleanor's. Not touching, but close enough that anyone watching would understand. Eleanor was smiling. She was wearing the light blue dress that Walter had bought her in Florence 2 summers ago. They had been walking through a market near the Ponte Vecchio on a warm afternoon, and she had stopped in front of a small shop window and looked at the dress for a long time without saying anything. Walter had gone inside and bought it while she pretended not to notice. When he gave it to her that evening at the hotel, she had held it against herself in front of the mirror and said she would save it for something special. Something special. The man said something Walter could not hear. Eleanor laughed softly, the kind of laugh Walter had not heard from her in years. Not the polite laugh she used at charity dinners, not the tired laugh she gave when he made the same joke for the 3rd time. A real laugh, a young laugh. The laugh of a woman who has remembered something about herself that she had forgotten. She reached across the table and laid her hand on top of the man's. By tonight, she said just loud enough to carry across the morning air. This will all be over. The man lifted her hand. He kissed the inside of her wrist. And then he said so quietly that Walter almost missed it. We begin. Walter did not move. He did not feel anger. He had expected anger. He had prepared himself for it the way a man prepares himself for a blow he can see coming. But the blow did not land where he expected. What he felt instead was something that did not have a name. Something like the feeling of standing in a house you have lived in for 26 years and suddenly realizing that you have never known the people who live there with you. Not the house, not the rooms, not the furniture or the paintings or the garden. The people, the one person. He had spent his career reading faces across boardroom tables. He could look at a man for 30 seconds and know whether he was lying, bluffing, stalling, or afraid. He had made a fortune on that skill. He had built his entire company on the simple ability to see what other people were thinking before they said it. And he had never read the face that slept on the pillow beside his. He turned away from the screen of Jasmine. He looked down at Elias, who had also seen it, who had also heard it, and whose small face had gone very quiet the way a face goes quiet when it has confirmed something it was hoping to be wrong about. "Come with me," Walter said. They walked back along the wall around the corner and through the side door that led into the laundry room. Walter knew this part of the house only vaguely. He had spent 26 years living here and could not have told anyone before this morning what the laundry room looked like. There were machines he did not know the names of, shelves with products he had never used, a window above the dryer that looked out toward the front gate. He found this fact almost funny. In the cold and distant way he was finding many things funny right now. He took out his phone and called Garrett Reed. "Garrett," he said when the line picked up, "I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions yet. Are you at home?" "Yes, sir. I'm off today." "You told me last week, remember? You said the company was sending a car from a different service because mine was in for maintenance. I figured you got the dates mixed up, but I didn't want to call and bother you about it. Mr. Graves is something wrong." There it was. The lie had been planted a week ago by someone who had access to his schedule, his phone, his driver's contact, and the company's internal communication format. Someone who had spent enough time inside the walls of this house to know exactly which threads to pull and when to pull them. "Garrett," Walter said, "your car is not in for maintenance, is it?" "No, sir. It's in my driveway right now." "I thought so." Walter exhaled slowly. "I need you to drive over here. Park one street away on Ashmont. Do not come up to the gate. I will call you again in a few minutes." He ended the call. He stood very still in the laundry room. Through the small window above the dryer, he could just see the corner of the front gate. The town car was still there. The fake driver was still standing beside it, waiting for a man he believed would walk out and get in and not see his own home again. Walter turned to Elias. The boy was standing near a stack of folded towels, his small back pressed against the wall. "Elias," Walter said, "I need you to do something very important. Go to your mother. Tell her you are not feeling well. Tell her your stomach hurts and you want to lie down. Do not lie about anything else. Just that. Then stay in your room until I come and find you. If anyone asks where I am or what I am doing, you say you have not seen me since breakfast." Elias thought about it for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, sir, I can do that." Walter knelt down again. His knees ached. His back ached. His chest held a weight that had nothing to do with his body. He brought his eyes level with the boys, and he spoke slowly because what he was about to say was not the kind of thing you say quickly. "Listen to me. What you did this morning was the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. And I have been in rooms with generals and governors and men who thought they were brave because they had money. None of them did what you did. You walked across this yard knowing that nobody might believe you. You grabbed the sleeve of a man you have never spoken to, and you told him the truth when lying would have been safer and easier, and nobody would have blamed you for it. I want you to remember that. Whatever happens in the next few hours, whatever you hear, whatever you see, I want you to remember that you saved a man's life today. And nothing that happens after this changes that fact." The boy's eyes were very wide and very still. For a moment they were wet. Then they were not. "Yes, sir," he said. "Good. Go." Elias turned and walked out of the laundry room. Walter heard the soft sound of his shoes on the tile, then on the wooden floor of the hallway, then nothing. He stayed where he was for almost a full minute, listening to the house. It was strange how a house could feel familiar for 26 years, and then in the space of a single morning feel like the inside of a stranger's body. The same walls, the same floors, the same light falling through the same windows onto the same furniture, and all of it meaning something completely different than it had meant an hour ago. Walter straightened his tie. He picked up his briefcase. He walked out of the laundry room. He did not go to the front door. He went to his study first, because that was where the missing folder was supposed to be. He stood in the study for 30 seconds, opened a drawer, closed it, walked to the bookshelf, walked back. He was setting a small piece of evidence in his own mind, the way a chess player places a piece on the board without yet knowing how he will use it. He did not know who in this house was watching, but he wanted there to be a trail of him doing exactly what he had said he would do. Then he walked to the front foyer. Eleanor was already there. She had come in from the patio and was standing by the long mirror near the front door adjusting an earring. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "There you are," she said. Her voice was warm, patient, slightly amused. The voice of a wife who has been married long enough to find her husband's absent-mindedness endearing rather than annoying. "Did you find it?" Walter looked at her. He looked at the woman he had married in a small chapel in Virginia 26 years ago, when his beard was still dark and his company was still small enough to fit in a single office. The woman who had cried during his mother's funeral, who had held his hand in a hospital waiting room for 14 hours without letting go the year he turned 63, who had once driven through a snowstorm to bring him a change of clothes when he was stranded at a hotel near Albany because she said she did not want him to have to sleep in a suit. Jam. He looked at her and he saw beneath the soft and familiar smile the cool calculation of a person measuring whether a problem had been solved. He had spent 40 years reading faces across boardroom tables. He could read a liar at 30 paces. He could spot a bluff before the cards were turned. And he had never once looked carefully at the face across his own dinner table. "I found it," he said. He held up a folder he had picked off his desk. It contained nothing important. Printed copies of a quarterly forecast that had already been emailed to him 3 days ago. But Eleanor did not know that. She nodded. "Good, now go. You'll be lucky to make it on time." He took a small step closer to her, the way a husband does when he is about to leave for the day. He kissed her on the cheek, lightly, just below the ear. Her perfume was the same one she had worn for 9 years. He had bought her the last 3 bottles himself. Each time she had thanked him, and he had said it was nothing, and each time he had meant it because it was the kind of small thing he could do without thinking, and he had mistaken not thinking for caring. "I love you," she said. He did not answer. He could not. He simply gave her the small, private smile he had used 1,000 times before, the smile that meant nothing and everything, and had become so automatic that neither of them noticed it anymore. Then he turned toward the door. He walked out onto the front steps. The town car was 30 feet away. The fake driver had straightened the moment the door opened and was now standing beside the rear door with one hand on the handle. His posture was correct. His jacket was clean. His face was composed. He looked like every professional driver Walter had ever seen, but he was not wearing a silver ring. Walter walked down the steps slowly, looking at his phone, scrolling through emails he was not reading. He did this for the length of the stone path, one step after another, calm, ordinary, a man walking to his car on a Monday morning. Yeah. He did this until he was perhaps 15 feet from the car, and then without breaking his pace, without looking up, he changed direction by about 10 degrees, just enough to pass the car and continue toward the small pedestrian gate on the far side of the driveway. The fake driver hesitated. Walter could feel it without looking, the small disruption in the air behind him. The man had been told exactly what would happen, exactly how the morning would go. The target walks out. The target reads his phone. The target gets in the car. The target closes the door. The target does not look up until it is too late. The man had not been told what to do if the target walked past him. "Mr. Graves," the driver said. Walter kept walking. He raised the phone slightly to his ear as if taking a call and said in a clear and ordinary voice, "Yes, I'm walking out now. No, I'll meet you at the corner. The driveway is blocked." He pushed open the pedestrian gate and stepped out onto the street. The town car did not follow. It could not. The driver had no instructions for this scenario. He was a man standing beside an open door with a plan that no longer had a next step. Walter walked 20 steps down the sidewalk, turned the corner, and saw Garrett Reed's silver sedan idling against the curb exactly where he had been told to wait. Garrett had been Walter's driver for almost 4 years. In that time, he had seen Walter tired, angry, distracted, and on 2 occasions slightly drunk after a difficult quarterly review. He had never seen him look the way he looked now, walking down the sidewalk with his briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other, his face composed in a way that did not match anything happening behind his eyes. Walter opened the passenger door. He did not sit in the back. He sat in the front next to Garrett, the way a man sits next to another man, when the distance between them needs to be smaller than it usually is. "Drive," he said. "Not toward the office, not toward the airport. Just drive." Garrett pulled away from the curb. They drove 2 blocks in silence. Then Walter's phone lit up on his knee. The The screen showed one word, Eleanor. He let it ring twice. Then he picked it up, because not answering would tell her something. She would call the driver. The driver would walk up to the house. The plan would shift, and whatever small advantage Walter had right now would disappear into the Monday morning air like steam from a coffee cup. Eleanor. Walter, where are you? The driver just texted me. He says he has been at the gate for almost 10 minutes. Her voice was warm, patient, slightly concerned, the way a wife sounds when her husband has forgotten where he put his keys again. I came back inside, Walter said. I forgot a folder for the Hartwick meeting. When I came back out, something felt off about the car. Different driver. I called the company, and they had no record of the change. I thought it was safer to leave on my own. I am with Garrett now. There was a small silence on the line. Walter could almost hear her thinking. He could almost see the calculations behind her eyes. The same calculations she had probably made 100 times in the past year, weighing what she could say against what she could not, what she could explain against what would expose her. That is very strange, she said. Are you all right? I am fine. Do you want me to call the police? Not yet. Henry is looking into it. The company is investigating. I will be home this afternoon. Walter. Her voice softened, became careful, tender, the way it always became when she wanted him to stop thinking and start feeling. He understood now that it was a tool, a precise and practiced tool calibrated over 26 years. I am worried. Please come home. Whatever this is, we can figure it out together. I know we can, he said. He ended the call and set the phone face down on his knee. Garrett was watching the road. His hands were steady on the wheel. The silver ring on his left thumb caught a sliver of light from the morning sun. Garrett, Walter said. There is a coffee shop on Pierce Street, the one with the green awning. Park behind it. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Walter watched the city slide past the window and thought about how strange it was that everything outside the car looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. A woman was walking a dog. A man was opening the front gate of a hardware store. A delivery truck was double parked beside a bakery with its hazard lights blinking. None of it knew that a man had almost disappeared from the world this morning. None of it would have noticed if he had. Henry Aldrich was already at the coffee shop when they arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees and a leather folder. Dressed in the same plain dark suit he wore to every meeting, whether the stakes were $10 or $10 million. He stood when Walter walked in. The 2 men shook hands in the careful way of men who have known each other long enough to skip everything except what matters. Garrett stayed by the door, his back to the room, watching the street through the glass. Walter sat down. Henry slid one of the coffees across the table. Tell me, Henry said. But Walter did not begin with the story. He began with the analysis, because that was who he was. That was who he had always been. A man who understood the shape of a problem before he asked anyone else to look at it. My life insurance policy, Walter said, issued 11 years ago. Original coverage $4 million. It was raised once after the company went public. You were in the room. That adjustment was clean. But there was a second adjustment, 14 months ago. I believe the coverage was raised to $35 million. An accidental death rider was added. The beneficiary clause was simplified. I believe my signature was forged. I believe the notary who witnessed it has disappeared. And I believe the day it was signed, I was in Tokyo. Henry set his coffees down slowly. In 19 years, he had heard Walter speak in this exact tone only twice before. Once during the takeover battle in 2014, and once on the night Walter's mother died. How do you know this? Henry asked. Walter reached into his jacket and set the cracked phone on the table between them. Then he told Henry the rest. The boy, the recording, the patio, the dress from Florence, the man with the careful hair, the fake driver at the gate, Garrett's fabricated text message. He spoke for almost 15 minutes without stopping. His voice was flat and efficient, the voice he used when reporting losses to a board. He left nothing out. Henry listened. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. He listened the way good lawyers listen, which is to say he missed nothing and wrote nothing down and let the silence between sentences do the work that questions would only interrupt. When Walter finished, Henry opened the leather folder. 3 printed pages. I had this within 40 minutes of your call this morning, he said. I have not slept much in 19 years, and I do not intend to start today. He laid the pages on the table. Walter's policy, the adjustments, the signatures, everything Walter had already deduced confirmed in black ink on white paper. The second adjustment, Henry said, tapping the third page. 14 months ago, coverage raised to 35 million. Accidental death rider doubles the payout to 70 million under specific circumstances. Beneficiary clause simplified. All conditional language removed. Eleanor is the sole beneficiary. No contestable provisions. No waiting period. Walter looked at the page. He could see his own signature at the bottom. He recognized the shape of it, the small curl at the end of the second letter of his last name, a habit he had developed in his 30s and never broken. But he did not remember signing it. The notary, Walter said, retired 4 months ago, moved to Arizona, has not answered his phone in 2 weeks. Eleanor was in Greenwich 14 months ago for the Hadley fundraiser. Yes, and the day before the fundraiser, according to the notary's log, you signed this document. I was in Tokyo that day. I know. The two men looked at each other across the small table. The coffee shop hummed quietly around them. A spoon clinked against a cup. Someone laughed at the counter. Henry, Walter said, I want to know everything. Who he is, where he comes from, how long this has been planned, and I want to know it before she does. Henry closed the folder. He looked at Walter with the steady patience of a man who had built his career on one simple rule: protect the client, even when the client is sitting across from you with a cracked phone in his pocket and the sound of his own wife's voice planning his death still ringing in his ears. I already started, Henry said. I have a private investigator. Her name is Claire Dunning. She is very good and very quiet. I called her before I left my house this morning. She is already pulling records. Walter nodded. He picked up his coffee and took a long sip. It was lukewarm. It was the best coffee he had ever tasted. One more thing, Walter said. He set the cup down and looked at Henry with the eyes of a man who had spent his entire life making decisions that other men were afraid to make. I do not want him arrested for intent. When the time comes, I want him caught in action. He has done something like this before. I can feel it. And if he has, then he has walked away before. I will not let him walk away again. Henry was quiet for a long moment. That is more dangerous, he said. Yes, Walter said. It is. You are sure? Walter thought about Margaret, whose name he did not yet know, who had gone for a hike on a Saturday morning in Michigan and never come home. He thought about Renee, whose name he did not yet know, who had gone to sleep in her own house in Phoenix and never woken up. He did not know their names yet, but he knew they existed. He knew it the way a man who has spent his life reading patterns knows when a pattern has been running for longer than anyone realizes. I am sure, Walter said. Henry nodded once. He gathered the folder. He stood. He rested one hand briefly on Walter's shoulder in the way that men do when words are not enough and touch is not too much. Then he walked out of the coffee shop into the bright and ordinary morning. Walter sat alone at the table. Garrett was still by the door watching the street. The coffee shop continued its quiet hum. The world continued its ordinary business. And Walter Graves, 71 years old, salt and pepper beard, hands steady, eyes clear, sat in a corner booth and began to plan. Not his defense, his counterattack. That afternoon, Walter checked into a small hotel on the north side of the city. It was the kind of place that catered to traveling consultants and regional sales managers. Men with rental cars and wrinkled shirts who checked in late, ordered room service they did not finish, and left before sunrise without remembering the color of the curtains. The kind of place where nobody looked at your face when you signed the register and nobody remembered it after you left. Henry had chosen it. Henry had paid for it under a name that did not appear on any of Walter's accounts. A corporate card linked to a holding company that existed for exactly this kind of purpose, the kind of purpose that nobody talks about until they need it. The room was on the 4th floor, a window facing the parking lot, a bed with a brown comforter that had been washed so many times it had forgotten what brown meant, a small painting of a sailboat above the desk, curtains the color of old coffee. Walter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for a long time. He had not stayed in a place like this in 20 years. Maybe longer, since the early days of the company when he drove between warehouses in a used pickup and slept wherever was cheapest and closest. He remembered those rooms. He remembered the hum of the ice machine down the hall, and the way the television always took a few seconds to warm up, and the particular loneliness of eating a gas station sandwich at 11 o'clock at night while going over freight manifests with a highlighter pen. He had been younger then, hungrier. His beard had been dark. His back had not ached. His wife had been a woman who called him at 10 every night to tell him about her day and ask about his, and he had answered every call, and they had laughed about small things, and the distance between them had been measured in miles, not in silence. He found to his own surprise that he did not mind this room. There was something almost restful about it, something honest. A room with no pretense, no marble, no fountain in the yard that cost more than a house, no paintings chosen by a decorator who had never met him. Just a bed and a desk and a window and the quiet sound of the parking lot below. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Henry. 2 sentences. Claire has a name. Calling you in 5 minutes. Walter stood and walked to the window. The parking lot was mostly empty. A delivery van idled near the back entrance. A woman was loading grocery bags into the trunk of a small sedan, one bag at a time, carefully the way people do when they are in no hurry to get where they are going. The world continued. It always did. That was the thing about the world that Walter had learned a long time ago. It did not stop for you. It did not slow down. It did not notice when a man's life split in half on a Monday morning. It just kept loading groceries into trunks and delivering packages to back doors and humming along at the same steady and indifferent pace it had always hummed. The phone rang. Walter, Henry's voice, calm and measured the way it always was when the news was bad and needed to be delivered in straight lines. Claire is on the line with us. She is going to walk you through what she found. Listen first, questions after. A new voice came through, low, professional. A woman who had spent her career finding things that other people had gone to great lengths to hide. Mr. Graves, my name is Claire Dunning. I will keep this brief. Go on, Walter said. The man you saw on your patio this morning is using the name Dominic Hale. That is not the name he was born with. Walter sat down on the edge of the bed. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked at the carpet. It was the color of sand. There was a small stain near the leg of the desk that someone had tried to clean and given up on. He was born Adrian Voss, Claire continued. Richland Center, Wisconsin, 1983. His father was a mechanic. His mother left when he was 7. He had a younger sister who went into foster care at 12. He grew up fast and smart and angry, and by the time he was 25, he had learned something that most people never learn, which is that the easiest way to become wealthy is to become necessary to someone who already is. She paused, not for effect, for precision. Claire Dunning was not a person who used words carelessly. His first wife was a woman named Margaret Voss. They married in 2007. She was 41 years old. She had inherited a small manufacturing business from her father. She was not rich by the standards of the world you live in, Mr. Graves, but she was comfortable. She had a house on a lake in northern Michigan. She had savings. She had a life insurance policy worth $3.2 million. Walter closed his eyes. In the spring of 2009, Margaret went hiking on a trail she had hiked dozens of times before. A trail with a steep section along a ridge overlooking a gorge. She did not come back. Her body was found 2 days later at the bottom of the gorge. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. It was ruled accidental. Adrian Voss was the sole beneficiary of the policy. He collected the full amount. He changed his name legally within 6 months. The room was very quiet. Walter could hear the delivery van pulling away from the back entrance of the hotel. He could hear the faint sound of a television through the wall, someone watching a game show, the audience applauding something that did not matter. In 2014, Claire continued, he was living in Seattle under the name Daniel Carr. He was engaged to a woman named Karen Lynn, software executive, successful, independent. She broke off the engagement 6 months before the wedding. The reasons are not in the public record, but she filed a restraining order 3 weeks later. The order was granted. He left the state within a month. She figured it out, Walter said quietly. That is my assessment as well. She is the one who got away, the one who saw something before it was too late. And the others did not. Claire did not answer that directly. She moved on, the way a surgeon moves on from one incision to the next. Not because the first one does not matter, but because stopping to dwell on it will not help the patient on the table. In 2017, he surfaced in Phoenix. New name, Dominic Hale. He married a woman named Renee Castell. She was 53. He was 34. She was wealthy. Private equity money. She had no children, no siblings, no close family. They were married for 2 years and 8 months. She died in 2020. A house fire. The fire department investigation lasted less than 2 weeks. Electrical fault in the kitchen. It was ruled accidental. He was not home at the time. He had a dinner receipt from a restaurant 30 miles away, time-stamped and paid by credit card. The insurance payout was $4.8 million.
Dasava.
Walter rubbed his hand slowly across his jaw. He felt the familiar texture of his beard beneath his fingers. The same beard he had trimmed that morning in the same bathroom mirror he had used for 26 years, standing 3 feet from the bedroom where Eleanor was still asleep, or pretending to be asleep or lying awake thinking about the plan that was now only hours from execution. And now, Claire said, he is here, with a new name, with your wife, with a $35 million policy and a stretch of road outside Hartwick where the water is deep and the current pulls toward the spillway and cars have been recovered weeks later, sometimes months. For a moment, no one on the line said anything. Walter opened his eyes. He looked at the small painting of the sailboat above the desk. A simple boat on a simple sea, painted by someone who had probably never sailed, hung on a wall by someone who had probably never thought about it again. And here it was, a small rectangle of color in a brown room being looked at by a man who had just learned that the woman he loved had invited a professional killer into his home. Claire, Walter said, does Eleanor know any of this about his past? About Margaret? About Renee? There was a small pause. I cannot answer that with certainty, Claire said. But based on what I have found, I would say no. The information about Adrian Voss is not easy to find. The name change was clean. The records are scattered across 3 states. The only reason I found it as quickly as I did is because the notary in Greenwich, the one who retired to Arizona, had handled paperwork for Dominic Hale once before. A real estate transaction 2 years ago. That gave me a thread to pull. Without that, it would have taken much longer. Then she does not know she is in bed with a man who has killed before, Henry said. She does not know, Walter said slowly. But she is still in bed with a man she hired to kill me. Those are 2 different facts, and both of them are true at the same time. Nobody argued with that. What do we do? Walter asked. But the question was not really a question. He was already thinking. Already 3 moves ahead. The way he had always been. The way he had survived every boardroom, every negotiation, every man who had ever underestimated him because of his age or his accent or his refusal to raise his voice. We can go to the police now, Henry said. We have the recording, the insurance documents, the false signature, the witness, the history on Voss. It is enough to open an investigation. He would be arrested within 24 hours. Eleanor would be questioned. She would hire a lawyer. The case would move slowly, but it would move. And he would hire a lawyer too, Walter said. Yes. And his lawyer would argue that the recording was made without consent, that the insurance documents prove nothing about intent, that the notary is missing and cannot testify, that the history in Michigan and Phoenix is circumstantial, and the case would take 2 years. And at the end of it, a jury would look at Eleanor and see a 65-year-old woman with no criminal record, and they would look at Dominic Hale and see a man in an expensive suit with a good attorney, and the whole thing would come down to the word of a 10-year-old boy against the resources of a man who has walked away from this kind of thing twice before. Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have been thinking about this." "I have been thinking about this since the coffee shop." "Then tell me what you want." Walter stood up from the bed. He walked to the window and looked out at the empty parking lot. The woman with the groceries was gone. The delivery van was gone. The lot was just pavement and painted lines, and the long shadow of the hotel falling across the asphalt like a sundial. "I want to go back to the house," he said. "Tonight, I want to walk through the front door and sit down to dinner with my wife and smile at her across the table and let her believe that her plan failed for a simple reason. A mix-up with the car service. A cautious husband who noticed something small and made a phone call. Nothing more. Nothing that leads back to the boy. Nothing that leads back to the recording. He turned from the window. And then I want to wait. I want to give them a second chance. I want them to believe that the plan can be fixed, that the mistake was mechanical, not structural, that the target is still a target. And when they try again, when they commit to the act, when they put men on the road and a car at the curve, and a plan in motion that cannot be explained away by any lawyer in any courtroom, that is when we close the door. That is dangerous, Henry said. Yes. If something goes wrong, if they change the plan, if they move faster than we expect, you could be dead before anyone reaches you. I know. You are 71 years old, Walter. I am aware of my age, Henry. I have been aware of it every morning for the past 6 years when my knees remind me before my alarm clock does. But I am also aware of something else. This man has killed at least 2 women. He has walked away both times. He changed his name and started over and found another woman and did it again. And if we hand this to the police and it falls apart in court, if he walks away a third time, then somewhere in a year or 2 or 5, there will be another woman sitting across from him at a table, and she will be smiling at him, the way Eleanor smiled at him this morning, and she will not know what he is. Walter paused. I will not let that happen. Not because I am brave, because I have spent my entire life finishing what I started. Henry was silent for a long time. Long enough that Walter could hear the faint hum of the telephone line between them, the sound of distance itself. All right, Henry said finally. Then we begin tonight. The drive back to the house took 22 minutes. Garrett brought the car through the front gate at 6:45, the way he had 1,000 times before. Walter sat in the back seat with his briefcase on his lap, his face composed in the careful neutrality he had practiced for an hour in front of the small mirror in the hotel bathroom. He had looked at himself in that mirror for a long time, studying his own face the way he would study a balance sheet or a contract or the face of a man across a negotiation table, looking for the tells, the small movements around the eyes, the tightness at the corners of the mouth, the way grief sits just beneath the surface of a face that is trying very hard to look like nothing has changed. He had practiced until nothing showed. Eleanor was waiting at the front door. She had changed since the morning. She was wearing soft gray pants and a cream sweater, and her hair was pulled back in the simple way she wore it when she wanted to look like she had not tried. It was a look Walter had always found beautiful, the kind of beauty that does not ask to be noticed, the kind that simply exists quietly like light through a window. He understood now that it was calculated, that everything about her appearance tonight had been chosen with the same precision that everything about the morning had been planned. The soft colors, the pulled-back hair, the bare feet on the stone steps. She was presenting herself as a woman who had been worried, a woman who had spent the day pacing, a woman whose only thought had been her husband's safety. She came down the steps and took both of his hands. Thank God, she said. I have been worried sick all day. Her hands were warm, her grip was firm, her eyes were wet in a way that looked real. And maybe it was real. Maybe some part of her, somewhere beneath the planning and the policy, and the man on the patio was genuinely relieved that Walter was standing in front of her alive. Or maybe she was relieved because a dead husband on a Monday afternoon with a suspicious car and a missing driver would have raised questions that a dead husband on a quiet Friday morning on a lonely stretch of highway would not. Walter could not tell. That was the thing that hurt the most. After 26 years, he could not tell. I am all right, he said. What happened with the car? The company is investigating. It looks like someone impersonated the dispatcher and rerouted the assignment. Henry thinks it may have been an attempted robbery. There have been several of these in the area recently. Wealthy men picked up in black cars. The drivers are sometimes paid off or replaced. He watched her face as he said it. He watched for the small flicker of relief that would tell him the explanation was being absorbed. The cover story sinking into place the way a key slides into a lock that was made to receive it. It came. A small softening around her eyes. A faint exhale she did not realize she had been holding. That is horrible, she said. I am so glad you noticed. I almost didn't. But you did. She put her arms around him. He returned the embrace, gently, the way he always had. He felt her breathing against his chest. He felt the particular weight of her head on his shoulder, the weight he had felt 1,000 times before in doorways and kitchens, and the quiet space between the end of one day and the beginning of the next. And he felt for the first time the specific sadness of holding a person who has decided you are worth more dead than alive. It was not a sharp sadness, not the kind that cuts. It was slow and large and quiet, the kind that moves in like a tide that has been coming for years, and you only notice it when the water is already at your ankles and your shoes are already wet, and it is too late to move to higher ground. They had dinner at the long table in the dining room. She lit candles. She poured him wine from a bottle he had bought 2 summers ago in Bordeaux, from a vineyard they had visited together on a day when the sun was warm and the air smelled like lavender. And she had leaned against his shoulder in the back of a small car and closed her eyes and said she wished they could stay there forever. She had meant it then. He believed she had meant it then. He had to believe that. Because if she had not meant it, then nothing in 26 years had been real. And that was a thought too large to hold in a room this small. She asked him about his day, about Henry, about the company's response. He answered in a calm and ordinary voice, giving her enough detail to seem honest and not enough to seem rehearsed. She listened. She nodded. She reached across the table once and touched his hand, and he let her, and he felt the warmth of her fingers and thought about the recording in his jacket pocket upstairs and the way her voice had sounded when she said the word patience. After dinner, she suggested they sit in the garden room. He agreed. They sat together on the long sofa. She rested her head briefly on his shoulder. He looked out through the tall windows at the dark shape of the patio where she had sat that morning with a man whose real name was Adrian Voss and whose hands had touched the hands of 2 dead women before they touched hers. At 10:30, she said she was tired. She kissed his forehead and went upstairs. Walter waited 15 minutes. Then he stood and walked quietly through the dark hallway toward his study. He closed the door behind him, turned on the desk lamp, and he did something he had never done in 26 years of marriage. He opened Eleanor's desk. It was a small writing desk in the corner of the room near the window that overlooked the south garden. Eleanor used it for household correspondence, for writing thank you notes after dinner parties, for keeping the small notebooks where she tracked appointments and grocery lists and the kinds of things that make a house run without anyone noticing that someone is running it. Walter had never opened it, not out of respect for her privacy, out of indifference. He had simply never been interested in what was inside it. He had been too busy with contracts and freight routes and quarterly projections and the 1,000 small decisions that had to be made every day to keep an empire running. He was interested now. The top drawer held stationery, envelopes, stamps, a fountain pen that Walter had given her for their anniversary 8 years ago, still in its box, never used.
Charm.
He paused at that, the pen in its box, a gift he had bought in 15 minutes at an airport shop in Chicago because he had forgotten their anniversary until he saw the date on his boarding pass. He had wrapped it himself in the airline lounge. He had given it to her that night with a card he had written on the back of a cocktail napkin. She had smiled and thanked him and put it in the drawer and never used it. He had not noticed. He opened the second drawer. A small brown notebook, leather cover, no label, no markings. The kind of notebook you buy at a bookshop when you want something that feels personal but does not announce itself. Walter opened it. The first few pages were ordinary. Lists, appointments, phone numbers, the name of a dentist, the name of a florist, a note about a charity event in March. Then the pages changed. Starting about halfway through the notebook in Eleanor's small and careful handwriting, there was a log. Not of her days, of his. Monday through Friday, week after week, for 6 months. 7:15 comes downstairs, suit already on, goes to kitchen. 7:20 pours coffee, checks phone, does not look up. 7:25 walks to foyer, puts on coat, does not check pockets. 7:30 walks to car, phone in right hand, briefcase in left, gets in without looking at driver. 7:35 car leaves through front gate, does not look back. Every morning, documented, cataloged. 6 months of Walter's habits recorded in a notebook that sat in a drawer 12 feet from where he worked every evening. She had studied him the way an engineer studies a machine. Input, output, timing, pattern, weakness. She had written down the things he never varied. The coffee, the phone, the briefcase in the left hand, the way he walked to the car without looking up, the way he got in without looking at the driver, the way he never looked back. She had found the rhythm of his blindness, and she had used it. Walter closed the notebook. He placed it back in the drawer, exactly where it had been. He did not take it. He did not photograph it. He left it there because taking it would change the weight of the drawer by a fraction of an ounce, and a woman who had spent 6 months documenting the small details of a man's morning routine was a woman who would notice if something in her own desk was missing. He turned off the lamp. He sat in the dark study for a long time, listening to the house settle around him, the small sounds of wood and glass and stone contracting in the cool night air. He thought about the pen in the box, the anniversary he had forgotten, the nights Eleanor had eaten dinner alone in this house while he was in a city whose name he could not remember closing a deal, whose details he could no longer recall. He thought about the 26 years of small absences that had accumulated like dust on a surface nobody cleaned. Not because they did not care, because they stopped looking. He had not been a bad husband. He had never raised his voice. He had never missed a payment. He had never been unfaithful. He had provided everything a person could ask for, everything except the one thing that could not be bought and could not be scheduled and could not be delegated to a housekeeper or a cook or an assistant. He had not been present. He had been in the house, but not in the marriage. He had been at the table, but not in the conversation. He had been in the bed, but not in the room. And Eleanor had stopped waiting for him to arrive. That did not excuse what she had done. Nothing excused what she had done. But it explained something that Walter needed to understand if he was going to sit across from her at breakfast tomorrow morning and smile and drink his coffee and pretend that he did not know. He went upstairs. He brushed his teeth in the guest bathroom down the hall from the master bedroom. He changed in the dressing room. He got into bed beside Eleanor, who was lying on her side, with her back to him, breathing the slow and steady rhythm of someone who was either asleep or very good at pretending. He lay there in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to her breathe and thought about Margaret Voss, who had gone hiking on a trail she had walked 100 times, and Renee Castell, who had gone to sleep in her own home and never woken up, and Eleanor, who was lying 3 feet from him, breathing softly alive and warm and planning his death. He did not sleep. The next morning, Walter woke before the sun. Or rather, he opened his eyes because waking implies having slept, and he had not. He had spent the night in a state that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness, a gray territory where thoughts moved slowly and shadows took shapes that were not quite recognizable. Eleanor was already up. He could hear the faint sound of water running in the master bathroom, the small clink of bottles on the marble counter, the particular quiet of a woman going through a morning routine she has performed 10,000 times. He dressed. He went downstairs. He sat at the small table by the kitchen window and poured himself coffee and opened his phone and began reading emails. When Eleanor came down, he looked up and smiled, the same smile he had given her for 26 years, the smile that had become so automatic that it no longer required the participation of any emotion at all. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning. Did you sleep?" Like a stone. She poured herself coffee. She sat down across from him. The morning light came through the window and fell across her face in a way that made her look 10 years younger. For one unguarded moment, Walter saw her the way he had seen her at that faculty dinner a lifetime ago. The woman in the green dress, laughing at something, unperforming, real. Then the moment passed, and he saw the other woman, the one who kept a notebook in her desk. They ate breakfast together, toast and jam and coffee, the ordinary meal of an ordinary marriage on an ordinary Tuesday. Walter did everything the same as he always did. He read his phone. He finished his coffee. He kissed her on the cheek when he stood up. He walked to the foyer. He put on his coat. But he did not go to the office. He went to the study, and from the study he called Henry. It was a short call. Henry reported that Claire's team had placed a surveillance vehicle outside the property, unmarked. 2 operatives. They would rotate in 12-hour shifts. They were watching the front gate, the service entrance, and the staff residence behind the south wing. "Has anyone come or gone?" Walter asked. "Not yet, but we are watching." Walter ended the call. He walked to the window of the study and looked out toward the back patio. Eleanor was there. She was sitting at the wrought iron table with a cup of tea and a magazine. Alone this time. No man across from her. No careful smile. Just a woman sitting in a garden in the morning sun. He watched her for 3 full minutes. Then he saw something that changed the weight of the day. A figure crossed the back lawn coming from the direction of the garage. Tall, lean, dark jacket. The same careful posture Walter had seen the morning before. Dominic Hale walked across the grass with the easy stride of a man who had been here before, who knew the grounds, who felt comfortable enough to use the back entrance as if it belonged to him. He reached the patio. Eleanor looked up. She did not stand. She did not wave. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at someone they are expecting. He sat down in the same chair. He said something Walter could not hear. Eleanor nodded. And then Dominic turned his head slowly and looked toward the south wing of the house, toward the staff residence, toward the small brick building where Nora and Elias lived. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said something to Eleanor. She answered. He looked at the building again. Then he turned back to her and the conversation continued. Walter felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, not anger. Something more precise. The feeling of watching a predator scan the edges of a clearing looking for movement. 20 minutes later, Dominic left the way he had come. Across the lawn, through the garage, gone. That evening at dinner, Eleanor asked a question that confirmed what Walter had suspected. The housekeeper, she said, cutting her chicken carefully with a knife. Nora, her son, Elias. Does he ever stay up late? I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway the other night near the kitchen, around midnight. She said it casually, the way a person mentions a draft in a room or a noise from the attic, something small, something that probably means nothing. Walter took a sip of his wine. He let the silence stretch for 2 full seconds before he answered. Not long enough to seem evasive, just long enough to seem thoughtful. I have no idea, he said. I barely know the boy. I think I have spoken to him once, maybe twice. He seems quiet, Eleanor said. He is 10, Walter said. Most 10-year-old boys are either too loud or too quiet. There is no middle ground. Eleanor smiled at that, a real smile or the shape of one. Walter had stopped looking for the difference. But the question stayed with him. It stayed with him through dessert, through the hour they spent in the garden room, through the kiss on the forehead and the soft footsteps going up the stairs. It stayed with him because it was not a casual question. It was a probe, a careful, precisely aimed probe designed to determine whether anyone in the house had been awake on the night the conversation happened. They were looking at the boy. They did not know what Elias had heard. They did not know about the phone or the recording. But they knew that someone might have been awake. Someone might have been near the kitchen, and they were narrowing the list. At 10:45, Walter slipped out the side door of the south wing and crossed the dark yard to the staff residence. The night air was cool. The boxwood hedge was a dark shape against the darker sky. A single yellow light glowed above the door of the small brick building. He knocked softly. Nora Benson opened his door. She had a tired face, an intelligent face, the face of a woman who had worked hard for a long time and expected to keep working hard for a long time more. She was in her mid-30s. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were still damp from washing dishes. When she saw Walter standing on her doorstep at nearly 11 at night, she did not look surprised. She simply stepped back and let him in. He is asleep, she said quietly. He came home yesterday morning saying his stomach hurt. He has not eaten much. He fell asleep on the couch around 8. I moved him to his bed. May I see him? She led him through the small front room past a tidy kitchen with 2 clean cups drying on a towel to a doorway at the back. Elias was curled on a narrow bed under a thin blue blanket. His shoes were on the floor beside him. His school bag was open on the chair, a notebook spilling out the pages covered in small, careful drawings. Walter stood in the doorway and looked at him. The boy who had walked across a yard and grabbed the sleeve of a man he had never spoken to and said the words that had changed everything. He was sleeping the way children sleep when they are exhausted. Completely. Without reservation. As if the body had simply decided that it had carried enough for one day and shut everything down without asking permission. Walter turned back to Nora. I owe you the truth, he said. Some of it tonight, the rest in a day or two. Will you sit with me for a few minutes? She nodded. She led him back to the small kitchen. They sat across from each other at a wooden table that had been wiped clean so many times the surface was smooth as glass. She did not offer him tea. She did not waste motion on small things. She folded her hands and waited. He told her, not everything, Not Adrian Voss, not Margaret or Renee, not the notebook in the desk, but enough. He told her that there had been a plan against his life that morning, that her son had warned him, that her son had almost certainly saved his life, and that the people behind the plan did not yet know that they had failed in the way they had failed. Nora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a long moment with her hands still folded. Her eyes were wet, but she held them steady. Nothing fell. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "Not this, but something. He has been quiet for more than a week, drawing the same things over and over. I asked him 3 nights ago if anything had happened. He said no. I should have asked harder." "He kept it from you to protect you," Walter said, "not because he did not trust you." She nodded slowly. She looked toward the doorway where her son was sleeping. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to act exactly as you have always acted, in front of my wife, in front of anyone else. I need Elias to stay in this house with you until I tell you otherwise. There will be people watching the property. You will not see them. They are there to keep you and your son safe." And then, Walter said, "In 2 days, maybe 3, this will be over. And then we talk about what comes next." She looked at him for a long time, measuring him, he thought, deciding whether to trust him. He understood. She was a woman who had spent her life trusting carefully, because trust for people who work in other people's houses is not given freely. It is earned, and it can be revoked without warning. "Mr. Graves," she said, "my son did what he did because he believed it was right, not because he expected anything from you. I want you to know that." "I do know that," Walter said. "That is why it mattered." He stood, he thanked her. He walked to the door and then stopped. He turned back. "Nora," he said, "she asked about Elias tonight, at dinner. She asked whether he stays up late, whether he might have been in the hallway near the kitchen the other night." Nora's face went very still. "I told her I barely know the boy," Walter said. "I told her he is 10 and that 10-year-old boys are either too loud or too quiet." She seemed satisfied. "But I want you to know, they are looking. They are looking at the staff. They are looking at anyone who might have heard something. And your son is the smallest and the most invisible person in this house, and that makes him either the safest or the most vulnerable. I am going to make sure it is the first." Nora stood very straight. Her hands were no longer folded. They were at her sides and they were shaking, and she was letting them shake because she had decided that hiding it from this man was not necessary. "Thank you," she said. Walter walked back across the dark yard, past the boxwood hedge, past the cypress trees where he had knelt with Elias 24 hours ago, through the side door, through the dark hallway, up the stairs. Eleanor was asleep, or performing sleep. He had stopped needing to know which. He lay down beside her. The next evening was Wednesday, 2 days since the morning behind the cypress trees. Walter sat down to dinner with Eleanor at the long table. Candles, wine, the same ritual, the same choreography, the same performance of a marriage that had become indistinguishable from the real thing, because the real thing had stopped existing so gradually that neither of them had noticed the exact moment it disappeared. They were halfway through the main course when Walter set down his fork.
Chat.
"I have to go to Hartwick on Friday morning," he said. His voice was easy, conversational. The voice of a man mentioning a schedule changed the way you might mention a weather forecast. "The meeting from this week, they rescheduled it. I should have gone Monday. I cannot put it off again." Eleanor's knife paused on her plate. The pause lasted less than a second, not long enough for most people to notice. But Walter noticed. He noticed because he had spent 2 days learning how to read the face he had spent 26 years not reading. And in that fraction of a second pause, he saw something move behind her eyes. A quick flash of something that might have been calculation, or relief, or fear, or all three at once braided together so tightly that even she might not have known which one was leading. "Of course," she said. She resumed cutting. "Is the company sending a different car this time? Henry is arranging it through a new service. He says they have vetted everyone. Garrett will be driving. I told the company I wanted him specifically." "That sounds wise." She looked up at him across the candles. She smiled, and he smiled back. Two people sitting across a table from each other in a house full of shadows playing a game that only one of them knew was a game and the other thought was real life. and neither of them was entirely wrong. "Be careful on that road," she said. "The one outside Hartwick, by the reservoir. It bends sharply in a few places." "I know," Walter said. "I have driven it a dozen times." "I know you have." She lifted her wine glass. "I just worry." Walter lifted his glass as well. They touched the rims together gently, the way they had 1,000 times before. The crystal made a small, bright sound in the candlelit room, a sound that in another life might have been beautiful. Later that night, after Eleanor had gone upstairs, Walter walked one more time to the small brick building behind the south wing. The yellow light was on. Nora was still awake, but he did not go inside. He walked past the building to the far edge of the property where a low stone wall separated the garden from the wooded lot behind it. He stood there in the dark, looking up at the sky. The stars were out. The air was cold. The house behind him was lit in a few windows, glowing against the night like a lantern in a field. He had built that house. He had paid for every stone and every beam and every pane of glass. He had filled it with furniture and paintings and the small expensive objects that wealthy men collect because they cannot, because they need them. And somewhere in the process of building and filling and paying, he had forgotten to live in it. He thought about Friday morning, the car, the road, the reservoir, the men who would be waiting at the curve, the men who would be watching from behind. He was not afraid. He had been afraid once behind the cypress trees when a boy in a faded shirt had told him that his wife wanted him dead. That fear had lasted about 90 seconds. Then it had been replaced by something else, something harder and colder and more useful. The feeling a man gets when he has been underestimated for the last time. Walter Graves was 71 years old. His beard was going white at the edges. His knees ached when it rained. He had a heart that his doctor said was strong enough for another 20 years, and a mind that his competitors said was the sharpest in the industry. And in 2 days, he was going to drive down a road that had been chosen for his death, and he was going to drive past the place where they planned to stop him, and he was going to watch the doors close on every person who had decided that he was old enough and blind enough and distracted enough to kill. He stood at the stone wall for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, past the yellow light of the staff residence, past the dark shape of the cypress trees, through the side door, through the quiet hallway. He went to his study, he sat at his desk, he picked up the phone and called Henry one last time. "Friday," he said. "Everything moves on Friday." "I know," Henry said. "Is Claire ready?" "She has been ready since Tuesday." "And the detective?" "Detective Sandville has been briefed. She will move on the house the moment you give the signal from the road." Walter nodded to himself in the dark room. Through the window, he could see the faint outline of the garden, the greenhouse glass catching the last of the moonlight. "Henry," he said. "Yes." "Thank you. For 19 years. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause that held more than words could carry. "Get some sleep, Walter," Henry said. "You have a long drive on Friday." Walter set the phone down. He leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but for the first time in 3 days he rested. The way a man rests before the last morning of something he has been preparing for his entire life without knowing it. Friday morning came the way certain mornings come, when everything that matters has already been decided, and the day is simply the container that holds the consequence. Clean, cold. The sky the color of pale slate above the tree line. No wind, no clouds. Just the flat gray ceiling of an October dawn pressing down on the rooftops and the driveways and the quiet streets of a neighborhood where every house cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Walter Graves came downstairs at 7:30. He had spent the last hours of Thursday lying on his back with his eyes open, watching the ceiling fan turn slowly in the dark, counting its revolutions, the way he used to count freight trucks as a boy from the window of his father's house in Monticello. He had reached 412 before he stopped counting. Eleanor was beside him. He did not listen to her breathing this time. He listened instead to the house, the settling of wood in the walls, the tick of the hallway clock that had been his mother's, the small sound the pipes made when the heating cycled off. He was memorizing it, not because he loved the house, because by tomorrow evening it would belong to a different version of himself, and that version would hear these sounds differently than the man who was lying there now. He had thought about Elias, about the cracked phone in a boy's pocket, about how the entire machinery of justice, insurance, investigation, and arrest had been set in motion by a child who had walked across a dewy yard in a faded blue shirt and grabbed a stranger's sleeve. He had thought about how the world turns on small things: a ring on a thumb, a book forgotten on a kitchen table, a boy who came downstairs at the wrong time and heard the right thing. He had not slept. He put on a dark suit. He knotted his tie in front of the mirror the way he had knotted it 10,000 times before the simple double Windsor his father had taught him in the kitchen of the house in Monticello when Walter was 14 years old and going to his first funeral. His father's hands had been rough from the fields. His father's voice had been quiet. His father had said, "A man ties his tie the same way every time. That is how people know they can count on him." Walter looked at himself in the mirror. 71 years old. Salt and pepper beard trimmed close. Lines around the eyes that had not been there 10 years ago. Hands that were steady. A jaw that was set. He did not look like a man who was afraid. He did not look like a man who was pretending not to be afraid. He looked like a man who had moved past fear entirely and arrived at something on the other side of it, something that did not have a name, but felt like the stillness at the center of a wheel that is spinning very fast. He picked up his briefcase. He put on his coat. He walked downstairs. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She was standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in her hands. She was wearing a white blouse and dark slacks. Her hair was down. She looked rested. She looked, Walter thought, like a woman who had slept well because she believed that today was the last day she would have to pretend. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." She handed him his coffee. He took it. Their fingers touched for a fraction of a second during the transfer the way they always did, and he felt the warmth of her hand and thought about all the mornings this small gesture had happened without either of them noticing it. All the mornings it had been real, and all the mornings recently when it had been something else. He took a sip. The coffee was good. She had always made good coffee. Even in the early years when they lived in the small apartment in Alexandria, and the coffee maker was a $10 drip machine from a department store, and the mugs were mismatched and chipped, and the kitchen table was a folding card table they had bought at a yard sale. Even then, the coffee had always been good. Eleanor set down her cup and walked over to him. She reached up and adjusted his tie. A small adjustment. The kind a wife makes when a husband has been tying his own tie for 50 years and still manages to get it slightly crooked. Her fingers moved against his collar. Her eyes were on the knot. Her face was close to his. "There," she said. "Better." She stepped back and looked at him. And for one moment, one unguarded and unexpected moment, her eyes changed. Something moved across them that was not calculation and was not performance. Something that looked almost like grief. The grief of a woman standing in front of a man she had once loved, knowing what was about to happen and knowing that she had chosen it, and knowing that there was a version of her life where she had not. Or maybe Walter imagined it. Maybe he saw what he wanted to see. Maybe after 26 years, a man cannot stop looking for the woman he married, even when she is standing right in front of him, wearing the face of someone he no longer knows. "Be safe," Eleanor said. "I will." She kissed his forehead, lightly, the way she had kissed it 1,000 times before. And he let her. Because that was what a man who did not know would do. A man who trusted his wife and kissed her goodbye on Friday mornings and drove to meetings in small towns and came home in the evening and never thought about the space between leaving and returning. Walter walked out the front door. The morning air hit his face, cold and sharp and real. The kind of air that reminds a man that he is alive simply by being uncomfortable enough to notice. The car was at the gate, a black sedan. Same model as Monday, same color, same position in the driveway. A driver standing beside the rear door with one hand on the handle. But this time the driver was Garrett Reed, and on Garrett's left thumb catching the pale light of the October morning like a small piece of the moon was a silver ring. Walter walked down the stone path at his usual pace. He did not look at his phone. He did not look at the house behind him. He looked at Garrett, and Garrett looked back at him with the steady eyes of a man who understood what was about to happen and had agreed to be part of it and had not been asked to agree because he would have volunteered. Walter got into the back seat. Garrett closed the door, walked around to the front, got in, started the engine. The car pulled smoothly through the gate and onto the street, and the gate closed behind them with the soft mechanical sound that Walter had heard every weekday morning for 2 decades. He did not look back. For the first 10 minutes, they drove in silence. Through the neighborhood, past the houses with their manicured lawns and their iron gates and their security cameras that watch the street with the patient indifference of machines that do not care what they see. Past the school where children were already arriving, dropped off by parents in cars that cost more than the teachers' annual salaries. Past the small park where Walter had once taken Eleanor for a walk on a Sunday afternoon years ago, when walking together was something they still did. They reached the highway. Garrett merged into the northbound lanes. The traffic was light. The sky was still gray. The trees along the median were beginning to turn the first edges of gold, appearing on the maples, the way age appears on a man's beard, starting at the edges and working inward. After 15 minutes, Garrett's eyes moved to the rearview mirror. "They are behind us," he said quietly. "How many?" "One car, dark gray sedan, 2 men inside. They picked us up near the Wilcox exit. They have been 3 cars back since then. Maintaining distance. Professional spacing." Walter nodded. He did not turn around. He did not look in the mirror. He kept his eyes forward on the road, on the trees, on the gray sky ahead. "Claire's team," he asked. "2 vehicles. A white panel van, 4 cars behind the sedan. A blue SUV, 2 exits back running parallel on Route 9. They have eyes on everything." Walter looked out the side window. The highway was cutting through farmland now. Open fields on both sides. Barns in the distance. Fences running along the edges of properties that had been in the same families for generations. This was the part of the country that Walter understood. The part that moved slowly and did not change unless it had to. The part that still believed in the weight of a handshake and the meaning of a man's word. He thought about Adrian Voss, a man born in a small town in Wisconsin who had learned how to become someone else, who had learned that the world is full of people who are lonely enough to believe in a new face and a warm voice and the careful performance of attention, who had married a woman in Michigan and walked with her along a trail above a gorge and watched her fall, who had married a woman in Phoenix and lit candles at dinner and gone out for the evening and come home to a house that was already burning, who had sat across from Eleanor on a patio in the morning sun and kissed the inside of her wrist and said, "We begin." Walter did not feel rage. He had thought he might when the moment came, when the car was moving and the road was narrowing and the reservoir was getting closer. He had thought that the anger would arrive the way it arrived in boardrooms, hot and focused and useful. But it did not come. What came instead was something colder and more patient. The feeling of a man who has set every piece on the board exactly where it needs to be and is now simply waiting for the clock to run out. They took the exit for Hartwick. The road narrowed from 4 lanes to 2. The trees grew closer to the shoulder, pressing in from both sides like walls. The pavement changed from smooth highway asphalt to the rougher surface of a county road that had been patched and repaired so many times it felt like driving over a quilt. Garrett drove steadily, his hands at 10 and 2, his eyes moving between the road ahead and the mirror behind. "The sedan took the exit," he said. "Still 3 cars back, 2 men. Driver is wearing a dark jacket. Passenger is on a phone." "Calling ahead," Walter said. "Yes, sir, I expect so." The road began to curve. The trees thinned out on the left side, and through the gaps, Walter could see the first glint of water. The reservoir. A long, flat sheet of silver gray beneath the gray sky, held in by a curving guardrail that followed the contour of the shoreline, the way a hand follows the edge of a table. It was beautiful. Walter noticed that. In the cold and distant way he had been noticing things all week, he noticed that the reservoir was beautiful. The water was still. The trees along the far shore were reflected in the surface so perfectly that it was impossible to tell where the real trees ended and the reflection began. A pair of birds moved across the water, leaving V-shaped wakes that spread out behind them and dissolved into nothing. 7 fatal accidents on this stretch in the past 9 years. That was what Henry had told him. The water was deep. The current near the spillway was strong enough to move a submerged car dozens of yards from where it entered. Recovery divers had found vehicles wedged against the spillway gates. Windows open, seats empty, the bodies carried downstream into the reservoir's deeper channels. It was exactly the kind of place a man would choose if he wanted an accident to look like an accident. "There," Garrett said. Ahead on the right side of the road at a small turnout where the shoulder widened and the guardrail was interrupted by a gap just large enough for a car to pull off a vehicle was parked, a dark sedan. And beside it, leaning against the driver's door with his arms crossed, was a man in a dark jacket. Walter recognized him. The height, the build, the posture, the way he stood with his weight on his left foot and his right hand resting casually on the door handle. It was the same man who had stood beside the town car at the gate on Monday morning. The same man who had been waiting for Walter to walk out and get in and not come back. He was waiting again. "Keep driving," Walter said. "Do not slow down. Do not speed up. Pass him exactly the way you would pass any parked car on any road on any morning." Garrett drove past the turnout at 45 miles per hour. The man beside the car straightened slightly as they passed. Walter could see his face in the side mirror. Young, hard, the face of a man who has been paid to do something and is focused on doing it correctly. He watched the black sedan pass him, and then he turned and got into his car. In the rearview mirror, Walter watched the gray sedan that had been following them slow down. The two vehicles were now behind them, one pulling out of the turnout and the other closing the distance from 3 cars back. "Now," Walter said. "Eek." Garrett pressed a button on the dashboard, a small black button that had been installed 2 days ago by a man Claire Dunning had sent a man who did not give his name and did not make small talk and finished the job in 11 minutes and left without saying goodbye. The button sent a single signal. 2 black SUVs that had been parked at a gravel lot a quarter-mile down the road pulled out simultaneously. One blocked the northbound lane. The other blocked the southbound lane. The road was closed in both directions in less than 8 seconds. The gray sedan braked hard. The car from the turnout, which had just pulled onto the road behind it, swerved to avoid a collision and came to a stop at an angle across the center line. The white panel van that had been following 4 cars behind the sedan pulled to the shoulder and stopped. 3 people got out. They moved quickly and calmly, the way people move when they have rehearsed something many times and are now simply performing it for real. The blue SUV appeared from a side road that connected to Route 9. It blocked the only remaining exit, a narrow farm road that led south toward the reservoir's service access. It happened in less than 30 seconds. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, not yet. Just the quiet and methodical closing of every door, every road, every option. The way a net closes around a fish that does not yet understand it is caught. Men and women in plain clothes stepped out of the SUVs. They approached the gray sedan from both sides. The doors were open. The 2 men inside were pulled out and placed on the ground with their hands behind their heads. They did not resist. Men who are paid to do violence for other people rarely resist when the odds shift suddenly and completely against them. They understand margins the same way Walter understood margins, and they could see that theirs had just disappeared. The driver from the turnout was already out of his car with his hands raised. He was younger up close than Walter had expected. 28, maybe 30. The kind of man who takes a job like this because he needs the money and does not think about what happens if the money stops being worth the risk. He looked scared, not of the people approaching him, of the sudden understanding that the story he had been told about how this would go was not the story that was actually happening. Garrett pulled the sedan to the side of the road and stopped. He put the car in park. He turned in his seat and looked at Walter. "It is done," he said quietly. "Not yet," Walter said. He took out his phone. He dialed Henry's number. It rang once. "They have the men on the road," Walter said. "Tell Detective Sandville she can move on the house." "She is already moving," Henry said. "She has been in position since 7 this morning. 2 officers at the front, 2 at the service entrance. She wanted to be sure no one left before the signal." Walter ended the call. He leaned his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment he did nothing but listen. He listened to the wind moving across the surface of the reservoir. A low, steady sound like breathing, like the breathing of something very large and very old and very patient. The water did not care what had almost happened on its shore. The water would have received the car and the body and the story the same way it had received everything else that had been given to it over the years, without judgment, without memory, without grief. Walter opened his eyes. Through the windshield, he could see the 2 SUVs blocking the road, the men on the ground, the officers standing over them. Beyond them, the reservoir stretched out flat and silver and still all the way to the far shore, where the trees were reflected so perfectly that the world looked doubled, as if there were two versions of everything, one real and one inverted, and the line between them was nothing more than the surface of the water. "Garrett," Walter said. "Sir, take me home." Garrett started the engine. He turned the car around on the narrow road. He drove back the way they had come, past the turnout, where the man in the dark jacket had been waiting, past the curve, where the guardrail was interrupted, past the stretch of road that had been chosen for its particular combination of depth and distance, in the kind of quiet that swallows sound. They drove back toward the highway. They drove back toward the city. They drove back toward the house. The drive took 47 minutes. Walter did not speak. Garrett did not speak. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of something that neither of them needed to say, because they both already knew it. The morning was over. The plan had held. The pieces had moved the way they were supposed to move. And somewhere ahead at the house, the last piece was being moved right now. When they pulled through the gate, the front of the property was already changed. Two unmarked cars sat near the front steps. A uniformed officer stood by the door. The house looked the same as it always looked. The stone facade, the tall windows, the fountain in the center of the circular drive still running the water, catching the late morning light in small, bright flashes. Everything was where it had always been. But the meaning of everything had shifted the way the meaning of a word shifts when you learn that the person who said it did not mean what you thought they meant. Detective Sandville was waiting on the front walk. A woman in her mid-50s, short gray hair, a dark jacket over a white shirt. She had the patient, watchful face of someone who had spent 30 years seeing the worst of what people do to each other and had chosen to keep showing up anyway. Not because she believed people would stop doing terrible things, but because she believed that someone had to be standing there when they did. "Mr. Graves," she said as Walter stepped out of the car. "Detective." "She did not run," Sandville said. Her voice was low and even. Professional in the way that certain kinds of professionalism are actually a form of kindness, a way of keeping the emotional temperature of a moment low enough for everyone to survive it. "She did not call anyone. She did not attempt to leave the property. She was sitting in the garden room when we came in. She was holding a cup of tea. She looked at us for a long moment, and then she said only one thing." Walter waited. "She said he told me he had done this before." She said it twice, as if she needed to hear herself say it. Walter stood very still on the front walk. The walk he had walked down 1,000 mornings. The walk where Eleanor had stood and waved goodbye on days when she was feeling sentimental and simply turned back inside on days when she was not. The walk where 3 hours ago she had kissed his forehead and told him to be safe. "And then?" Walter asked. Then she stood up. She put her hands behind her back without being asked. She did not say anything else. Walter nodded slowly. He looked at the front door of his house. The door was open. Through it, he could see the foyer, the long mirror, the table where Eleanor kept a vase of fresh flowers that the gardener replaced every Monday. The flowers were white lilies this week. They were still fresh. They would last another 3 or 4 days. And then they would die, and the gardener would replace them, because the gardener did not know that the woman who had chosen white lilies was not coming back. "I would like to see her," Walter said. Detective Sandville looked at him for a moment. She was reading him, the way good detectives read people. Not for guilt, not for innocence, for something more complicated than either, for the particular quality of pain that tells you what a person has lost. "She is being brought out now," Sandville said. They led Eleanor out of the house a few minutes later. She walked between two officers. Her head was not bowed. Her back was straight. She was still wearing the white blouse and the dark slacks she had put on that morning. Her hair was still down. She had not been handcuffed. She walked with her hands clasped in front of her, the way a woman walks when she is trying to hold herself together, and the only way she knows how to do it is to hold something, even if the something is her own hands. As she came down the front steps, she looked up. She saw Walter. She stopped. The officers beside her stopped as well. They were experienced enough to know that this moment was not in any manual, that no protocol covered what happens when a woman walks past the man she married 26 years ago on her way to a car that will take her to a place where people go when they have done the kind of things she has done. Eleanor looked at Walter. He looked at her. For one strange and final moment, they were not a man whose wife had tried to kill him and a woman who had paid someone to make it happen. They were two people who had once stood in a small chapel in Virginia and held hands and believed that the future was a place they would walk into together. Walter saw it in her eyes. Not all of it, not the planning, not the notebook, not the insurance policy or the forged signature or the man whose real name was Adrian Voss. He saw the other thing, the thing underneath all of it, the loneliness, the long, slow erosion of a marriage that had died not from hatred or violence or betrayal, but from the simple, ordinary absence of a man who was always somewhere else. He saw the woman in the green dress at the faculty dinner, the woman who had laughed at something, the woman who had been real. She was still in there, somewhere, under everything else. And that was the part that hurt the most. Not that she had become someone capable of this, but that the woman she had been was still visible, still recognizable, still present in the way she held her hands, and the way her hair fell across her shoulder, and the way her eyes, even now, even here, carried the particular weight of someone who knows they have done something that cannot be taken back. She did not speak, she did not apologize, she did not explain. She simply looked at him, and then she walked on, and the officers helped her into the car, and the car drove away, down the driveway, through the gate, onto the street, and gone. Walter stood on the front walk for a long time after the car disappeared. He stood there while the detective gave instructions to the officers. He stood there while the forensic team went inside. He stood there while the morning turned into afternoon, and the gray sky began to break apart, and the first pale pieces of blue appeared between the clouds like small windows opening in a wall. Garrett waited by the car. He did not approach. He did not ask if Walter was all right. He simply stood beside the driver's door with his hands folded and his silver ring catching the light, and his presence offering the only thing that presence can offer in a moment like this, which is the knowledge that someone is there and is not going away. The case moved faster than any of them expected. Adrian Voss, who had introduced himself to Eleanor as Dominic Hale, was charged within 48 hours. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, identity fraud, 4 counts in total. The charges were filed in the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, the story had reached the regional news, and by Wednesday, it had reached the national outlets, and by Thursday, it had become the kind of story that people discuss at lunch and forget by dinner. But the story did not end there. The 2 cases from Michigan and Phoenix were reopened. New evidence was found in both. Margaret Voss's death was reclassified from accidental to suspicious. The fire that killed Renee Castell was investigated by a new team with new technology and new questions. Witnesses who had been overlooked the first time were contacted again. Documents that had been filed and forgotten were pulled from storage and read by people who knew what they were looking for. The driver from Monday morning, the young man who had stood at the turnout by the reservoir, made a deal. He named everyone. He described the plan in detail. He provided dates, locations, communications payments. He gave the prosecution more than they had asked for because he was 29 years old, and he understood in the sudden and complete way that young men understand things, when the ground drops out from beneath them, that cooperation was the only door left open. The recording from a small cracked phone in a boy's pocket became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. 11 minutes and 42 seconds of 2 people sitting on a patio in the dark, planning the death of a man who was asleep upstairs. It was played in court on a Thursday afternoon. The courtroom was silent during the playback. The only sound was Eleanor's voice, calm and warm and measured, saying the words that she had said that night, and the sound of ice in a glass, and the sound of the patio door sliding open and closed. Eleanor was charged as a co-conspirator. She did not contest the charges. Her lawyer told the court that she wished to enter a plea. The judge accepted it. She spoke only once during the proceedings, a brief statement that her lawyer read on her behalf. It was 3 sentences long. Walter was not in the courtroom when it was read. Henry told him about it later at the coffee shop on Pierce Street, at the same corner table where they had sat on the morning everything changed. She said 3 things, Henry said. She said that she had met Dominic Hale, the man she knew by that name, at a fundraiser 2 years ago. She said that he had approached her during a period when she was, in her words, invisible in her own home. And she said that she did not expect forgiveness. She expected only that you would finally understand what it was like. Walter sat with his hands around his coffee cup. The cup was warm. The coffee shop was quiet. Outside, the city moved at its ordinary pace. Cars and pedestrians and delivery trucks, and all the small machinery of daily life that continues regardless of what happens inside the courtrooms and the kitchens and the bedrooms where people make the decisions that change everything. She was right about one thing, Walter said. He said it slowly, the way a man says something he has been carrying for a long time and is finally setting down. I was never there. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was not the kind of statement that makes everything all right, or puts the broken pieces back together, or undoes the sound of a wife's voice on a recording saying the word patience with the calm precision of a woman who has been planning something for a very long time. It was an acknowledgement, the simplest and most difficult kind, the kind that a man makes when he looks back at his own life and sees clearly and without excuse the places where he was absent, the dinners he missed, the conversations he ended, the mornings he walked to his car without looking back, the 26 years of being in the house but not in the marriage at the table, but not in the room in the bed, but not in the life. He had not caused what Eleanor did. Nothing excused what Eleanor did. But he had built the silence that someone else had filled. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that certain kinds of recovery are quiet. Not the dramatic silence of a crisis. The ordinary silence of a man putting his life back together, one small decision at a time. Walter moved his bedroom to a smaller room on the east side of the house. It had a single window that faced the garden, and in the morning the sun came through it in a clean, straight line that fell across the floor like a path. He had never used this room before. He had walked past it for 26 years without opening the door. Now he slept in it every night in a narrow bed with white sheets, in a single blanket, and he found that he slept better than he had slept in years. He sold the cars he did not use, the collection of vehicles that had accumulated in the garage the way expensive things accumulate in the lives of wealthy men, not because they are needed, but because they can be afforded. He kept two: the sedan that Garrett drove, and a small pickup truck that he bought from a dealer in town, dark green, used with 80,000 miles on it, and a scratch on the passenger door that nobody had bothered to fix. He drove the truck himself sometimes, on Saturday mornings when the roads were empty and the air was cool and the city was still asleep. He drove out along the county roads past the farms and the fields and the small towns where the hardware stores still opened at 7 and the diners still served coffee in ceramic mugs. He gave Garrett a permanent position with the company. A title, a salary, benefits, the kind of security that a man who wears his father's ring on his thumb and has never asked for anything deserves. Garrett argued with him for 20 minutes. Walter let him argue. Then he told him it was done. Garrett looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up and nodded once and said, "Thank you, sir." And that was the end of the argument. He hired a new household manager, a woman named Doris Whitfield, who had run a small bed and breakfast in Vermont for 30 years and had the kind of face that makes you feel like you have already met her and liked her and can trust her with your keys. Under Doris's care, the house began to change. Not in the way houses change after a death, with the sudden emptiness and the rearranged furniture and the flowers that nobody replaces. In the way houses change after a long fever breaks. Slowly, gently, with the gradual return of warmth to rooms that had been cold for a long time. Nora stayed. Walter had asked her if she wanted to sitting at the wooden table in her small kitchen on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the arrest. She had taken 3 days to think about it. Then she had said yes. She said yes because her son was settled. She said yes because the school was good. And she said yes because in her own careful and measured way, she had decided that Walter Graves was a man who had made mistakes and was trying not to make them again, and that was the kind of man she was willing to work for. Chapter. Walter moved her and Elias into a larger residence on the property, a small cottage that had been used for storage for years. He had it renovated, a real fireplace, a sunroom in the back with windows that faced south and filled with light on winter afternoons, a bedroom for Elias with a desk by the window, and a bookshelf that Walter stocked himself, spending an entire afternoon at a bookstore in town, reading the back covers of novels and asking the clerk which ones a 10-year-old boy who liked to draw might enjoy. Elias enrolled in a new school in the fall. Walter paid for it, not as a gift, not as a reward, as what he called, in the brief and unsentimental way he said most things, an investment in someone who has already proven what kind of man he will become. In the spring, almost 6 months after the morning behind the cypress trees, Walter walked out into the garden on a Saturday and found Elias sitting on the low stone wall near the greenhouse. The boy had grown since October. Not much, an inch maybe, but enough that his clothes fit differently, and his face had begun the slow shift from the roundness of childhood towards something leaner and more defined. He was holding a notebook on his knees. He was drawing. Walter walked over and sat down beside him. The stone wall was cold. The morning sun was just reaching the garden, turning the glass of the greenhouse into a warm amber glow. The rose bushes that Nora had planted along the south fence were beginning to bud. Small green knots on dark branches waiting for the heat. Walter looked at the notebook. Elias was drawing the rose bushes. Not in the way a child draws, with the shapes simplified and the colors bright and the details left out. In the way a person draws who sees things as they actually are. The thorns, the knots, the way the branches twisted around each other and reached for the light. "You still draw," Walter said. "My dad used to draw," Elias said. He did not look up from the page. His hand moved steadily. The pencil made a soft sound on the paper. "My mom told me he died when I was little. She said he drew on everything. Receipts, napkins, the backs of bills." Walter had not known this. He nodded slowly. "Then you come by it honestly," he said. They sat in silence for a while. The wind moved through the new leaves on the maple tree at the corner of the garden. A bird landed on the edge of the greenhouse roof, looked around, and flew away. The sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, and the morning settled into itself the way mornings do when there is nothing urgent and nowhere to be, and the only thing required of the people in them is to sit and breathe and let the world be what it is. "Mr. Graves," Elias said quietly. "Yes. Do you ever still feel scared about that morning?" Walter thought about the question. He thought about it for a long time because the boy deserved a real answer. Not the kind of answer adults give children when they want to protect them from something. Not the reassuring lie. Not the easy comfort. The real answer. The one that costs something to give. "Sometimes," Walter said. "Not the way I felt it then. Not the cold feeling. Not the feeling of the ground moving. But sometimes I wake up early before the sun, and I lie in the dark, and I remember the sound of the engine at the gate. The humming. The way it sounded when the driver had been waiting for more than 2 minutes. And I think about how close I came to walking past you. How close I came to looking at my phone instead of looking at your eyes. And what I feel then is not fear exactly." He paused. He looked out across the garden at the greenhouse glowing softly in the spring light. "It is something more like gratitude," he said. "Gratitude that has not yet learned how to sit still." Elias nodded slowly. The way he had nodded on that Monday morning behind the cypress trees. The way he nodded when he understood something that was too big for words, but not too big for the quiet space between two people sitting on a wall. "My mom says," Elias said, "that doing the right thing does not always make your life easier, but it lets you look at yourself in the mirror without having to look away." Walter looked at the boy, at the notebook in his hands, at the careful drawings of rose bushes and thorns and branches reaching for the light, at the small, serious face that had once appeared from behind a hedge and said two words that changed everything. "Your mom is right," Walter said. "She has been right about almost everything." They sat together on the stone wall for a long time after that. They did not speak. They did not need to. The sun moved across the garden. The shadows changed shape. The greenhouse glowed. The wind carried the faint, sweet smell of something blooming somewhere out of sight, the way good things sometimes arrive, not announced, not expected, but present and real and enough.